Welcome back to another edition of NBA Fantasy Baller, DFS edition, brought to you by Research Fantasy for this March 10th, 2017. Last night was a miserable night in the association. We talked at length about whether you want to go with Russell Westbrook or not go with Russell Westbrook, and he had a normal Russell Westbrook game, which will get it done, 9 out of 10 times. Our hope was that that situation was going to take place, but we could get somebody like Mike Conley, who we suggested, or potentially a Kyrie Irving or a Damian Lillard, who could come through to kind of combat that play with a better point per dollar outing and allow us to fit in Kawhi Leonard or LeBron James. But overall, it was just a gigantic flop for me, and I have no problem admitting it. If I've been playing DFS for 5 years now, believe me, I've had plenty of nights like this, and you will too, as you're playing, where things just go on outside of your control. The Spurs offense looked sluggish for a second straight game, even with LaMarcus Aldridge and Kawhi Leonard in there. It didn't help Kawhi's fantasy value that he got conked on the head and was being treated for concussion-like symptoms at the somewhere between the 6 and the 3 minute mark. I can't really remember, of time remaining in the third quarter. So we didn't see a full allotment of minutes from him. Even if we did, I'm not convinced he was going to get to the 40-point mark unless the rest of the team started to pick things up. Mike Conley was just awful. I mean, this guy it was like he just couldn't put anything together, and I don't attribute it to the matchup with Chris Paul, because he had a game against him earlier this year where he won plenty of people tons of money. He put up like 60 or 70 fantasy points against him. Big-time point guards, and yes, I do count Mike Conley as a big-time point guard. I think people forget about his actual skill level because he plays on a small market team in Memphis, and it's only compounded that they're really not popular DFS plays most of the time because they play at such a sluggish pace, and they had a strong defensive identity, but he just couldn't put it together. I'll tell you what, 10% shooting in the first half, ask DeMar DeRozan, it's just not going to get the job done. Maurice Bates, Patty Mills, Sean Long. I don't think Sean Long saw the floor. That was to be expected. We kind of hinted that Jahlil Okafor could play once he could play. That was it for Sean Long's fantasy value. I don't typically have any time, most days, to do updates and things of that nature. Yesterday was markedly worse because the lighting in here, there we go. Yesterday was markedly worse because my actual day job was just full of stuff I needed to do. But yeah, Andre Drummond, thank you for being a bright spot on what was an otherwise sad night. Actually, let's go one step further and let's cross over sports. Thanks to Johnny Gaudreau, Sean Monahan, Michael Furland, John Gabriel Pajot, Shane Gauthis-Bier, Eric Carlson. I'm throwing out a bunch of names that most people probably don't know if you're not playing NHL hockey. All of these guys were under like 9% owned. Most were under 8%. The top line from Calgary, which is one of my favorite lines to use, was under 4% owned. I get it was a little bit of a bigger slate, but that saved my night in a big way and actually turned a negative night into a pretty solidly positive night. So I encourage you to sign up for some of our mailing list for the NHL. Have a good idea every now and then with the sport. Overall, I'm a plus player, not to the extent that I am in the NBA, but I'm pretty decent at hockey. All right, let me shut up about sports that aren't related to the podcast. Let's move on to our core three today. I think these three guys could be in good positions. I think the main play I'm looking at is definitely a tournament option and maybe just for one specific site. But let's start things off with Kemba Walker, point guard for the Charlotte Hornets, 15K fantasy draft, 8,400 Fanduel, 8,100 DraftKings. Going up against Orlando, which should be fun. Charlotte is, I don't think Charlotte's a very good basketball team. Vegas seems to think that Charlotte holds a pretty big advantage here. I don't look at it the same way. I think this game's going to be close. It's actually one of my favorite games to use players from tonight. Charlotte really struggles from the three-point line in terms of allowing other teams to hit the three-point shot, really opening up the value on Orlando for guys like Evan Fournier and Terrence Ross, should he decide to perform tonight. I think that sets up nicely for Walker. Conversely, Elfrid Payton is on a very hot streak, but it doesn't include defense. So I think we could see a situation on his home court where we know he plays better over the length of his career. The Kemba should be able to hit us with 40 to 45 fantasy points at his price. That makes him a very strong play. Next up, let's go with Paul Millsap, power forward of the Atlanta Hawks. And Millsap is generally a pretty consistent player, just like anyone else. He's going to have his ups and he's going to have his downs. But in a matchup against Toronto that I think they're going to keep pretty close here, his price of $14K on Fantasy Draft, $7,900 on Fanduel, and $7,400 on DraftKings should open up things pretty nicely for you. I feel like Millsap should be good for around 40 fantasy points. In fact, I actually probably put him in the same vein of where I see Kemba finishing. Both of these guys do have 50-point upsides if things really go their way. Millsap could certainly put up a 22 and 15 line, especially if something were to happen like where Dwight gets into foul trouble. And we know the one benefit with Paul Millsap is you're going to get assists, you're going to get steals, you're going to get blocks, you're going to get turnovers, but he's a low-end triple-double candidate pretty much every night. And in a close game like this, I think this is an excellent spot to run him out at a really nice price. Moving on from there, probably my top tournament option tonight, and again, it does skew a little more to DraftKings than it does FanDuel or Fantasy Draft, is going to be Giannis Antetekuonmpo, point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, depending where you play. I've seen him really at all of those spots in a variety of fantasy sites. Milwaukee Bucks, 18K Fantasy Draft, 11-1 FanDuel, 10-1 on DraftKings. So you could see right away why we are gravitating towards DraftKings as being the place we want to go. Playing up against an Indiana Pacers team that he actually came pretty close to having triple-doubles on in both games he played against them earlier this year. Calculated the fantasy points, came out to around 57 DraftKings points at 10-1 for his upside being obviously in the high 60s or 70s. I think he's a worthwhile target in your lineups tonight. I'm not going to say stupid things like who could possibly guard him, because while it's true, who can possibly guard him on any team? There's very few teams that boast of the type of player that can actually keep Giannis in check. Giannis is the type of player that keeps himself in check. There's foul trouble. So there are some red flags, but overall, as far as a tournament option goes tonight, he is going to be one of my favorites. Let's move on to our three value plays for the evening. And I'm using DraftKings as my basis now, since that's where the majority of my action is at. $5,500 and under, so that just eliminates Marvin Williams, so I do think is still a fantastic play at his price. Let's start things out with Gorgui Dieng of the Minnesota Timberwolves going up against the Golden State Warriors. Now, there's some concern here that the game flow could benefit someone like Nemanja Bjelica a little bit more. And while I don't think he's an awful value play, you ultimately got to see where his floor was at in the last game, where he took all of our hopes and dreams and collectively flushed them down the toilet. I actually think this is a good spot for Dieng. 10-2 Fantasy Draft, $5,600 on FanDuel, $52 on DraftKings. They don't always necessarily play big, but I do think that Dieng is versatile enough to warrant staying on the floor. I think that they're not going to play Pachulia. Pachulia won't go over 20. JaVale probably won't go over 10. So that's only 30 points max at the center position, and Towns is going to be on the floor, I'd assume, close to 40 minutes. So there is some concern that instead of running 35 minutes, Dieng sees 27 minutes. I'm willing to take the risk. I think his floor is good enough, especially on DraftKings, that the price warrants it. For my absolute toss-up play of the day, because I do think this guy actually does have some upside that we've seen with Oklahoma City from time to time, and we saw it in Denver before that with a really crowded front court. Let's go to Chicago, and let's talk about King Joffrey Lauvergne. The Frenchman sits at minimum price, $6K fantasy draft, a little higher, 36 FanDuel, bottom barrel, $3K on DraftKings. If you've been paying attention to basketball this year, you know the Bulls are an absolute mess when it comes to their bench rotation. Fred Hoiberg apparently hates Nikola Mirotic. Joffrey Lauvergne will be part of the rotation moving forward. What does that mean? Who knows? Who has any idea exactly what that's going to mean? However, this is a high-paced matchup against the Houston Rockets. One thing Lauvergne does well that you don't necessarily get with Mirotic, and not the same with Bobby Portis, and you certainly don't with Felicio or Lopez, is that he can stretch the court. He gives them a threatening three-point presence from a big man, and he can also rebound if need be. So they could use him a little more. The Rockets like Clint Capella, and I think he's borderline a great value play. He's going to be in a ton of my lineups. He just didn't make the cut. I really wanted to get Lauvergne in there because there is the potential, if this game stays close and Lauvergne sees 25-plus minutes, that he can have an outing that exceeds 20 fantasy points, setting us up really nicely to fit more those Kemba Walker, Paul Millsap types in our lineup. Finally, I'm going to run out Jeremy Lin more than I probably should. Lin is going to be going up against Dallas, which is typically a no-no for Nick. Dallas is sluggish. They play at an absolute snail's pace, and they're a decently bad basketball team. You saw what they did against the Lakers. They could put a team just far enough out of reach that it can cause trouble to the fantasy perspectives of their opposing players. However, Brook Lopez is out tonight. Lin at 9,800 on Fantasy Draft, 5,400 on FanDuel, 5,000 on DraftKings. I think he can approach that 30-point mark tonight. All things considered, our projection model has him coming out at about 29 DraftKings points, which on the night actually is one of our higher point per dollar plays at the position, with Rajon Rondo, Patrick Beverley, Jerian Grant all following. So if you're looking for a couple of other plays in that range, that under 5K range, there are some plays for you right there. Otherwise, make sure you keep your eyes peeled. Watch the various sources of players being out, whether it be RotoWorld, RotoWire, Twitter. This is a time of the year where teams are going to be resting players. Things are going to get really crazy. Otherwise, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go to researchfantasy.com. Sign up for our NBA mailing list. Head over to Facebook. Like us there. Follow us on Twitter at Research and Win. And check in tomorrow for our next set of fantasy picks.